Hello, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about light from the perspective of nature. There we go. I think it's really important when we think about light to use it as a framing device to reorient our relationship to not just to the city, but to the city as it fits into all of nature. Much as in the past, people used to think that the Earth was the center of the universe, and then this guy, Nicholas Copernicus, in the 17th century, taught us that no, maybe the sun is the center of the universe, and that we're revolving around the sun. And he was called to be a heretic for that. And then in the 20th century, we learned that actually that's not the case either. The sun and the earth is just one little piece of a great universal fabric, and we're way out here on the edge. And this same way about thinking about where we are with respect to things like light and the sun is, I think, a really important way for us to reframe our relationship to the world that we live in. We can talk about light in terms of what it means for the buildings and for the open spaces and the urban heat island effect, as we heard about this morning. Or we can think about what light means to the ecology of the place that we live. And to do that, it helps us to think back to what this landscape was like for not just hundreds of years or thousands of years, but actually for millions and millions of years, a place of nature, a place that had plants and animals, including people, but not only people, that depended on the light of this landscape. And that light, for the most part, comes from the sun. The sun, which is a huge nuclear fusion reactor created by the very aggregation of the dense materials of the universe itself. At the core of the sun, it's 15 million degrees Celsius. At the core of the sun, it's 43 times denser than a diamond. And there, 4 hydrogen atoms come together and make a helium atom, and 0.7% of that energy leaks out in a series of photons, then have to work out through the matrix of the sun, so that when you go outside after this meeting and you're feeling the sun on your face, just realize that it took between 10,000 and 200,000 years for that photon to leave the sun and fly across the 193,000 miles to reach the Earth. The sun and light and energy are important because of thermodynamics, the fundamental laws of the universe. One of those is this one, that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed. And I think the corollary for that is that energy comes in many forms, including ourselves. Each of us is light. We are energy. This podium is energy. This building is energy. We are all in this continual transformation, this flux of energy through light and through materials and back to light. The second law of thermodynamics is a little bit of a downer. It's this idea that disorder is always increasing. And the corollary here is that each of us are little knots of order in a world of disorder, that the whole universe is moving to a final equilibrium, a sort of generic hum where there is no order. And the only way that we preserve order, that we preserve our bodies, that we preserve our buildings, that we preserve our ecosystems, that we preserve our planet, is by the continual infusion of energy. That energy comes as this unique thing, which is light, which is both a photon, a quanta, and a wave, traveling on these electromagnetic waves at the speed of light, the fastest thing we ever know, that we can imagine. And then when it reaches here, it fuels the amazing ecosystems and biomass of the entire planet. Every day, 12,000 times the amount of energy that humanity uses falls on the Earth in the form of sunlight. And most of that light is then used by the ecosystems. 4/5 of the biomass of the planet is actually in the oceans, is in the phytoplankton surrounding us. And it creates these beautiful patterns the beautiful patterns of ecosystems that characterize our planet and its evolution over time. This is the little piece of order that actually makes it all happen. This is a chlorophyll molecule. And this is nature's invention that actually captures the light and enables plants and other photosynthetic organisms to transfer that light into energy, into matter that then can pass up the ecosystems. And it fuels this amazing orderly round of the photosynthetic pathways that's happening, in the leaves of this fern right below here right now. And that everything in nature is trying to capture some of this energy. This is why when you go into a forest canopy like this one at the New York Botanical Gardens in the Bronx, it has these layers of canopy, this leaf area index as it's called, which is the amount of leaf area per area of ground space. And you can see how the plants are growing to try and capture as much of that light as possible and put it down into its bodies, into its roots, and that drives whole ecosystems that move from the plants through the herbivores and through the herbivores to the tertiary and quaternary consumers. And the important thing to say here is that every level of transformation, only about 10% of the energy gets through. So the sun provides so much energy and the plants capture a small percentage of that, and then only 10% of that moves up to the herbivores, and that there's this constant heat that's going off on the side. And this is a primary rule in ecology, is that the further you up the food chain, the more energy it requires at the bottom. And yet there's still enough energy that gets up that it can feed whales or kids and their gardens. Something also that's really important about the energy that comes from the sun is the way it drives the seasonal cycles around here. And because where we are on the Earth, about 41 degrees latitude, we have a 4-season climate here. That 4-season climate means that plants and animals have had to adapt to it. And they created this, trees are this remarkable structure that lose their leaves in the wintertime when you want the light to come through. And then in the summertime, when you want to be in the shade, they grow the leaves and capture that energy instead. And in the meantime, provide this sort of aesthetic resource and this reminder every day that we're part of nature's cycles. Not just people respond to this, but birds do. New York City, as our friends from the Audubon Society will tell us, is a hugely important place on the Atlantic Flyway for birds that are marking these seasonal patterns, both coming up out of tropical regions and regions in Central and South America, and up through those purple waves, through New York City. Do you see how we're a center of immigrants and then emigrants, and then back again in the fall? And not just the birds, but also the fish. New York City straddles the mouth of the enormous Hudson River, which leads into the upper watersheds of New York State and manages the capacity for millions and millions and millions of fish to come back and up and through and out the system every year. Fed by these seasonal dynamics, which in the water are marked by temperature changes and salinity changes. There are times of the year where it's fresh water practically to the tip of Manhattan, and other times where you have to go up to the Tappan Zee to find fresh water. It's as if the ecosystems change from a forest to a desert and to a forest back again every year. And of course it drives the climate. This energy is what also moves the clouds, that moves the water, that causes evapotranspiration. And to the sense that we add to the atmospheric composition, that we change it with our greenhouse gas emissions, of course, that changes the weather and therefore the climate in ways that are very difficult to predict because it's so big and it's so complicated that no computer is big enough to actually say for sure what's going to happen on a day-to-day basis. And that's why we get these surprises like Hurricane Sandy here. We've created a city that allows us to respond to changes in light conditions, as the earlier presentation showed for Bryant Park. It also creates the conditions that, sometimes we complain about the snow and the rain, and yet it's only because of the snow and the rain that we have water to drink and that New York City is livable at all. I just wanted to point out before I finish that there are also ancestral forms of sunlight that drive our city in the form of oil. Oil begins with phytoplankton, with little photosynthetic organisms that live in shallow seas in the past, hundreds of millions of years ago, and that through a complex and completely fortuitous process, because at every point there's processes, there's ways that could go away. The phytoplankton dies, and then it gets buried by a spring storm that allows it to be captured in its body form, the bodies of the phytoplankton before they decompose, and then somehow through geologic processes that gets pushed down into the subsurface 8 to 10,000 feet underneath the soil surface, and then eventually that hydrocarbon material migrates up, and most of it, 99% of it, reaches the atmosphere and disappears, but 1 to 2% of it's been captured under these reservoir rocks, which are what petroleum geologists look for. And we get all kinds of things from the soil. The blue lines on this flow diagram are all the kinds of products that come out of oil. The black is the fuel, the energy. That's mostly what we use oil for. It's such a rare and remarkable resource. It seems like it's such a shame just to burn it up, to release that energy to allow us to do other things. Other things like moving around, which is why I think this discussion around sunlight also touches on discussions around transportation. And to the extent that we can mold our transportation system to either use the energy that's in our bodies already as pedestrians or bicyclists, or to use energy that we're capturing today, not ancestral energy forms, and use it to run electric buses or trolley systems or the subway, that's a much more efficient way, not only to move people, but also to use the energy that the sun gives us. And here in the United States, we are gloriously blessed with enormous amounts of sunlight, particularly in the Southwest. These images in blue and gray all come from my book Terra Nova, where I wrote about the sun potential of the country and its wind power potential. Did you know that there's enough wind power off the Northeast coast to provide enough electricity for the entire United States? It's enormous how much wind, and that wind is driven by the climate dynamics, which are driven by the sun. And of course, we also live in a place that has wet mountains, and those wet mountains are a major way that we can both capture that energy for hydropower, but also store that energy that comes from the otherwise intermittent sources, as we call them. So I think I just want to end by saying, when we look up at the sky and we see these enormous buildings, let's not just think about the light that's coming in the windows to the office worker. Let's give a moment to think about the leaves and the clouds as well. And I think to do that, we need to sort of reorient our relationship to nature and to sunlight because of that. The man on the left here is the Sun King, Louis XIV. And the man on the right is James II, who is the Duke of York, for whom New York is named. Both these men were absolutist monarchs. They believed that God touched their families and that all power flowed through God, through them, and down to everybody else, through this sort of divine right of kings, that there was God who gave power to kings, who gave it to the nobility, who gave it to the peasants. And way down below at the bottom were these natural resources that were meant to feed the whole system. And I think this is actually the wrong way to think about it. This is an old, out-fashioned, inaccurate, scientifically implausible model of the world. And yet so much of New York City is still driven by this very idea. People 50 years ago had a different idea, and they started protesting, and that has led to the modern environmental movement, which I am a partial heir to. And in this movement was driven not just by observations about how the world is structured, but by huge anger about the destructions that have been wrought on the earth through deforestation and through climate change. And we still see this expressed through the young people today who are marching in the streets. And here the ideas of two equal and opposed forces, nature versus humanity. And the call is always that nature is fragile and will be destroyed through human activity. I actually think nature will beat humanity if we keep thinking like this. Then in the long run, nature will win out. Really, it's not that nature is vulnerable, it's that people are vulnerable in nature. And unless we take into account nature, we won't have a long tenure on this planet. So I think I just want to propose to you that there's a better way to think about that, and that is being invented here in New York City. It's being invented by people that are spending time in nature and taking care of that nature, like some of my friends and colleagues from the Natural Areas Conservancy here. it comes from recognizing the long and glorious history of this place that didn't start when the Europeans got here. That's just a coda to the history that's been come before. And to the extent that we can use the ecology of the city to build new ideas in how we get to the future, we'll be able to see how our city fits into the universe, how there's the earth, and on the earth there are these living beings of many and diverse kinds, and people are one of those kinds of beings. And I think this is a more appropriate model of our relationship to nature and to light. So it is true that we are powerful and we can create these shadows of shade and of death, but we can also open up the landscape and create light and health and productivity and a future for our kids and their kids. Thank you very much.